The night smelled of sweat, horses, and desperation. A dusty wind blew across the wooden beams of the old barn where lanterns hung, their light flickering weakly against the darkness. But the barn was not filled with the usual noise of cattle or the soft shuffle of hooves. Tonight, it was filled with men with sharp eyes, rough hands, and greedy whispers. They had not come for livestock. They had come for something far more cruel. At the center of the barn, pushed onto a makeshift stage, stood a girl, barely 16. Her dress was torn, her body trembling. She had given birth only hours earlier, her legs still weak, her body still bleeding. The blood stained the hem of her skirt, soaking into the dirt below. Her arms hung limply at her sides, her lips cracked, her skin ghostly pale. She swayed where she stood, barely clinging to consciousness. And yet, she was on the auction block. The auctioneer, a thick man with a booming voice and no trace of mercy in his eyes, lifted her chin roughly so the men could see her face. Here she is, gentlemen. Strong enough to give birth, young enough to last for years. She's a worker, she's a survivor. Who'll start the bidding? The men leaned forward. Some smirked, whispering crude comments. Others sized her up like they might a mule, calculating how much work they could drag out of her body. A few shifted uncomfortably, but not enough to leave. The girl's eyes stared into nothing. She had no strength to cry, no will to plead. In her mind, she prayed for only one thing, that it would end quickly. The bidding began. 50 cents. $1. $1.50. Her fate, her body, her dignity, all reduced to numbers tossed into the smoky air. She felt herself slipping, her legs threatening to collapse. She prayed they would. Maybe if she fainted, they would send her away. But no. The rough hand of the auctioneer steadied her, keeping her upright. And then, through the haze, she heard it. $2. The voice was different. Not sharp, not eager, not cruel. It was calm. Low. Almost reluctant. The crowd turned. At the back of the barn stood a man. A rancher. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a worn coat dusted from the trail. His hat shaded his eyes, his face unreadable. He didn't push forward like the others. He didn't leer. He didn't even seem to want to be there. He simply said his number and waited. No one raised him. The crowd, half expecting him to leave with disappointment, muttered among themselves. She wasn't worth much anyway, not in her condition. The auctioneer slammed his gavel. Sold. To the rancher in the back. And just like that, she was his. The girl's legs gave out. She crumpled to the ground, too weak to stand. The men laughed, some shaking their heads at the pitiful sight. The rancher stepped forward, his boots heavy on the dirt floor. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't answer their comments. He simply bent down, lifting the fragile girl into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her body limp against his chest. Pathetic waste of money, one man muttered. But the rancher ignored them. He carried her outside into the cool night air, where the stars stretched endlessly above the prairie. The girl expected cruelty. She expected his touch to linger, to own her, to claim what he had bought. She braced herself for it, too tired even to resist. But instead, nothing came. He set her gently on the back of his horse, climbing up behind her to steady her weak frame. He rode slow, careful, so she wouldn't fall. She didn't understand. By the time they reached his ranch, the horizon was pale with dawn. His house was simple but sturdy, wooden beams, a porch, lanterns glowing faintly inside. He dismounted, lifted her once more, and carried her inside. The house smelled of coffee and wood smoke. He pushed open the door to a small room. There was a bed, clean, simple, covered in blankets. Without a word, he laid her down. The girl stared at him, waiting for the moment when kindness would turn to cruelty. But the man only covered her with the quilt, tucking it gently around her shoulders. "Sleep," he said quietly. His voice was rough from years of dust and wind, but there was a gentleness buried in it. Then he stepped back, closed the door, and left her alone. For the first time in weeks, months, maybe years, she felt safe enough to close her eyes. And she slept. She slept like the dead, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. When she woke, sunlight streamed through the small window. The air smelled of bread baking. Her body ached, but the bleeding had slowed. She realized with a start that she was still dressed, untouched, unharmed. She sat up slowly, her throat dry. The door creaked open. The rancher stood there, holding a tray. A piece of bread. A cup of water. A small bowl of broth. "Eat," he said simply, setting it by her side. She stared at him. Words caught in her throat. Finally, she whispered, "Why?" He didn't answer. Not directly. He only said, "Rest. You'll need it." And then he left. Days passed. He brought her food, clean water, even bandages for her wounds. He spoke little, but when he did, it was never harsh. He asked nothing of her. No work. No payment. No submission. The girl began to heal. Slowly, her strength returned. The bleeding stopped. The shadows under her eyes softened. She still didn't trust him, not fully. She waited for the moment when his mask would slip, when kindness would reveal itself as another trap. But it never came. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the plains, she finally asked, her voice trembling. "You bought me, why?" The rancher was silent for a long time. He sat on the porch, his hat in his hands, staring at the horizon. Finally, he said, "Because no one else would let you rest." The word struck her like a thunderclap. Because no one else would let you rest. He hadn't bought her to use her, or to own her. He had bought her simply to stop her suffering. To give her something no one else had, a chance to be human again. Her throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes. She turned away, hiding her face. But for the first time in forever, she cried not from fear, but from relief. Weeks turned into months. The girl grew stronger. She began to help around the ranch, not because he asked, but because she wanted to. She milked the cow, tended the chickens, even learned to cook bread in the heavy iron oven. The rancher never interfered. He treated her not as property, but as someone who belonged. He gave her space. He gave her silence. And most of all, he gave her dignity. Slowly, she began to smile again. One winter evening, as snow fell soft outside, she sat by the fire with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The rancher sat across from her, mending a bridle. She finally found the courage to ask what had haunted her since that night. Why do you care?" she whispered. He looked up, his eyes steady. "Because once, someone cared for me when I didn't deserve it. A stranger. Long ago. I never forgot. Sometimes, kindness is the only thing that keeps a soul alive." The fire crackled between them. She stared at him, her heart swelling with something she couldn't name. Gratitude. Hope. Maybe even the first flicker of love. Years later, the girl, no longer a girl but a woman, would look back on that night in the barn, when she thought her life had ended. She would remember the laughter of the men, the sting of humiliation, the hopelessness in her heart. And then she would remember the rancher. The man who bought her not to break her, not to own her, but simply to let her sleep. That small act of mercy became the foundation of her new life. A life where she was no longer an object, but a human being with worth, with hope, with a future. The rancher never sought recognition. He never told the story. But she carried it in her heart, a living testament to the power of compassion. Because sometimes, the greatest gift you can give is not wealth, or power, or even love. Sometimes, the greatest gift is the simplest one. A bed. A blanket. A chance to rest. And from that rest, the chance to begin again.